so let's take advantage of that.
Okay.
So Taisha, we just want to get to know you a little bit, right? So maybe you can just give us a little bit of information about your childhood. Let's start with just a little bit of background on your family, kind of where you grew up, and just take us back to the beginning, essentially.
It's 6 of us all together. I have 6 brothers and sisters. I'm the oldest of 6. This is me and my uncle Ismail. He is 15 years older than me, and he always tells me the story about how I pooped in his pants when I was a baby. And if you meet him, he'll tell you too.
Bring him around, his boyfriend, right?
No, you can't bring him around. That's the first story. Tidy Boo Boo. You know why I call you Tidy Boo Boo, right? I got a brand new pair of khakis and I laid you down on them. You pooped all over my khakis, man. I was gonna be fresh. Yeah, I love my uncle. And this is me and my mom and dad. This picture is a reminder of 2 young people who didn't know what they was doing and didn't know where life was gonna take them and made a lot of mistakes, but they didn't mean to. It reminds me I was made in love. They just didn't know what they were doing. You know, when I look at the pictures that's right here and thinking about what I wanted to be when I grow up, and I wanted to be an architect. That's what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I was a little kid. I wanted to build a big house to put my whole family in, so we could have a TV family, kind of like the ones you see on the Cosby Show, and that's why I wanted to be an architect, so we could have a family where everybody gets along. I would have never thought life would have sent me on the trail that it sent me on, to be sitting here talking to you right now. I had a lot of other aspirations in life. It was right after my 14th birthday where I met my first trafficker. No one says when they're kids, I want to grow up and go all across the country and sell my body and give all my money to this guy who is going to beat me and make me feel as if I'm less than human. No girl says that when she's a kid. That's no one's dream. So you start talking to God and you're like, God, did you put me on this earth for this? Did you put me on this earth to be abused repetitively? Because it didn't just start there. It started way before. And you're just sitting there thinking, like, what kind of God are you to put me here for this, you know?
There's all types of experiences. I've had some guys who I saw for 3 years over a period of time and never had a problem with them, and I've had other guys who came in for 5 minutes and were trying to rape me or rob me or pulling knives on me or whatever the case is. So there's really no way to like protect yourself or know like what to expect.
This guy, this one in particular, he was completely naked when I got there. He opened the door, he was completely naked. He was high on cocaine. He was coming down, he was real agitated. He was trying to touch me, and I didn't want him to touch me because I was immediately repulsed. And this is the first time I finally like pushed back. I don't know what you're gonna do to me. He was threatening me. He basically told me if I don't do what he wants, he's gonna hurt me. And if he could kill me and nobody would care. He said that I can do whatever I want because I paid for you for 2 hours. I own you. And I knew that he was telling the truth. And I was thinking, like, how did I end up here?
Sex trafficking is modern-day slavery. We're dealing with the most important human rights issue of our time.
Too often people think that sex trafficking is something that happens over there with someone else's child. People are startled to find out that the vast majority of victims are American. They are in our neighborhoods, and oftentimes they're in our home, and we don't know it.
There's no state in the United States where it hasn't yet been documented. And so we're seeing it happen in rural communities and urban communities, suburban communities, affecting people of all races and ethnicities.
It's everywhere, and I think people are slowly realizing that there is no hiding place, and therefore it becomes a major issue, not just in California, but across the nation.
We've seen a trend, I would say, in the last 5, 6, 7 years where we've first started to hear the word trafficking. What we thought were prostitutes are actually enslaved human beings who've been tricked and being sold as objects.
Just because they don't see it on the street doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and doesn't mean that, thousands of young women aren't being victimized every year through this terrible crime.
We're talking about 14, 15, 16-year-old kids. They are required to go out and have extremely degrading sex acts with adults until they've reached a quota that they can bring home. And then maybe they're allowed to sleep, and then maybe they get a little food.
Every time you get into a car with a stranger, every time you walk into a hotel room with someone you don't know, you could be, it can turn on you in a second. So all the people who are surviving through prostitution have stories of violence at the hands of Johns, if not at the hands of pimps.
He would pull knives on us.
Permanent black eyes.
Sprawled out on the floor with him over top of me.
Punched me in my face.
Scars on my leg.
Pushed us out of cars.
He started to hit me.
My nose was broken.
It was like a fingernail foul. He started stabbing me.
Just stuff you don't really think really happens, but it does.
Those of us who are watching the street-level trafficking, who are watching the activity that is underground, who are watching the dark web, we see activity increasing. Now 80% of sex trafficking is happening on the internet, through apps, through social media.
It really happened in the late 2000s when we started doing everything online. It's just made it easier for people to commodify and buy people.
It took on a totally new character once people were for sale online. When a buyer had to go out of his way to drive to the track, to what was typically a seedier part of town, to buy sex, he had to take a few extra steps there, right, to be engaged in sex buying activity. But when he can log on to any site where paid sex is available, that creates a sense that sex buying is more normal than it actually is. When you start to realize just how many guys in the sex trade are looking more broadly for a very young female, it starts to become obvious why then people would try to supply underage girls in the sex trade.
we're seeing evidence that traffickers and buyers are targeting teens. We've seen the use of technology, social networking apps, and apps on phones being used to target children, to learn about their vulnerabilities and use that information as part of the trafficker's recruitment strategy.
No family and no kid is completely immune from this activity. Because of the reach of the social media, they're able to reach into the bedroom and actually seduce and deceive and manipulate even kids who don't come ready for this kind of exploitation.
It's not uncommon for them to send a blanket message to hundreds of kids saying something as simple as, "You're very pretty and I think you could make some money."
When you're asking about whether young girls are a target, they are the target. The younger the girl, the more cooperative she is, the less resistance. She isn't aware of what's going on, and she's easy to bait. The street value of girls is just like a product. So the younger the girl, the higher the price tag. The most requested age is 14.
Teenagers are particularly at risk for being recruited because they are thinking with the teenage brain. They're looking at finding connection, finding love, finding validation. They're trying on different personalities, different empowerments, and that's what the pimps just zone in on.
You may think trafficking recruitment isn't happening in your town, but it is. You just haven't seen it or you don't know what it looks like. But this is how easy it is. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in your malls. It's happening in your schools. It's happening in your library, at your movie theater. Guys come up, they see a group of girls or they see a pretty girl. You're beautiful. Hey, why don't you let me buy you something? You know what? I'm a modeling photographer. I'm a movie caster, whatever. And they get the girl to believe just enough. And then they get her to trust him. And then he buys her a bunch of stuff. And then maybe her parents think, oh, this is a great guy. This is a modeling agent. This is my daughter's future. And pretty soon he has more access and more access and more access. And pretty soon she doesn't come home.
The victims often have what we call multiple trauma, complex trauma, because they've already suffered trauma. They're basically ripe for this kind of exploitation because they've already been exploited. Their life has been tough. They've been thrown out of the house. Their parents don't act like they love them. They abuse them. They've witnessed domestic violence. They've been molested as small children. They've been sexualized so that their bodies don't feel already like they belong to them. So what the traffickers tell them is at least you can make money off of it.
I think that a lot of things that had to do with my upbringing and the sexual abuse, the combination, kind of prepped me for a trafficker, associating with abuse with love. This person loves me if they hit me because they're disciplining me. I didn't value my body. I didn't value me.
You know, when you grow up with sexual abuse, you tend to associate sex equals love. And I started to realize, well, all I'm good for is sex. That's all I'm good for.
The easy targets are the ones that are already broken down. They're already looking at the ground. They already hate themselves. They're already bullied. They already think that they're not worth anything and no one cares.
They know how to lure them into this sex trade, usually just by starting off with, by paying attention to them, by being a strong role model they never had in their own lives.
So when pimps approach teenagers, they don't say, here's a great idea, let's do a job where you give me 100% of your money, and it's physically demanding, psychologically exhausting, and sort of soul-crushing in a lot of instances. Instead, they say, let's go party, it's gonna be fun, you're gonna have all the power. And very quickly, the narrative changes.
Sex trafficking isn't just a girl being kidnapped out of her home or a girl being snatched away. Sex trafficking is as easy as Bobby from the barber shop pulling up on your daughter. Oh, your mom made you mad. Your dad made you mad. Oh, don't worry about nothing. Bobby's gonna take care of you. Let's go shopping. Let me help you pick out some clothes. Let me do your makeup. You never had that done. Let me give you everything that you've never had done, and I'm gonna kiss on you a little bit, tell you how much I love you, and this is what you gotta do for me. And we gonna go all across the world and do it. And I'm gonna make all your dreams come true the way your family didn't do it.
It's a Romeo thing, like it's coercion, and it's fraud, and it's you really feeling like you love this person.
I remember that I liked him. I thought he was a cool dude. He was always appeared, to be looking out for my best interest. And, we kind of developed a relationship where he knew I needed money. And then he easily exploited that. So he was getting what he needed out of the deal. There was no real care for my well-being at all.
They start out with a seasoning process where it's one instance where I need you to do this for me. And then when the child resists doing it again, it's not uncommon for the trafficker to say, I know where I got you. I will go back and I will kill your family. I will beat up your family. In other instances, they've taken images of child pornography of that victim, and they say, if you run away from me, I'm gonna send these to your family, to the other people in your school, to your community, so that they think negatively of you.
It was confusing for me because I agreed to do so many things out of fear that I normally wouldn't do. And so I just started feeling really weak and really stupid. And so, I just really lost my self-identity. I already didn't have a self-identity enough. And so once he came into the picture, I just completely didn't know who I was. So
I was conditioned to think that this was normal. First name whore, middle name whore, last name whore. And that's what I embodied.
We see a lot of similarities between domestic violence victims and sex trafficking victims. And this is because the mentality is actually very similar. And that is that there's this one person in a girl's life who is her provider, her companion, maybe the only person she sees that isn't a client. And he does everything for her. So who would she be without him? Where would she go? And one of the things that traffickers do is they disconnect this girl from every support system and everyone in her life. And within a short time, we find that girls will literally do anything for her pimp because he's the only thing that she has. There are hotbeds of sex trafficking in the United States. Southern California is definitely one of them. What we're finding is that locally, a lot of the trafficking cells are in Los Angeles and in San Diego. And these are where we have concentrations of pimps, enforcers, where girls are actually living. Trafficking is going to be most prevalent where there's money, right? They need buyers. So Southern California particularly attracts tourists. Hollywood attracts tourists. That's one of the big reasons that LA is really popular for trafficking. Also, sporting events is one of the big draws. Conventions is another big draw. When you find that in San Diego, Atlanta, any place like that where people can come in and out quickly and disappear, that's where you're going to find a real prevalence of trafficking.
In San Diego County, sex trafficking is the second largest criminal industry, so that means this is a big problem. We understand from our undercover work that the buyers here pay more for victims, and so that makes it a hub for that sort of activity for prostitution. The traffickers are mostly gang members, so that makes it even more complex. It's hard enough to get a victim to come forward in domestic violence because of the attachment to the abuser. But when you add the intimidation that comes with having the abuser be part of a gang, so it's not just the abuser, the trafficker, but his whole gang set that's going to come after the victim, it provides just more challenges.
The gang members will even share these women back and forth among gangs. It's unheard of when you're dealing in drugs or other illegal activity. About $800 million in San Diego County alone for human trafficking. That's a lot of money.
When we're talking about who is trafficking girls now, the trend is becoming increasingly toward gangs and organized crime. However, we're also seeing opportunistic pimps. And at the foundation of it is money. Humans are a renewable resource in that if I sell you drugs, I have to give you the drugs and you take off with them. But if I give you a girl, I get her right back just the same as I gave her to you. I haven't lost anything.
We were finding that on average, they were telling us they're making somewhere in the range of $120,000 per victim. And on average, we're controlling between 4 and 5 victims in a year. So, making upwards of $600,000 a year is a very lucrative business.
The money didn't go to me. It didn't help me pay for school. It didn't help my kids. It didn't help me pay my rent. I didn't even have a house to live in. It went to my pimp, it went to his drugs, it went to his fancy shoes, it went to his Gucci clothes, and it went to his rims and his system and his car and his rap career.
They were pimps. They made money off of women. They surrounded themselves by women. They talked to women. Their get up from the time they woke up to the time they went to sleep was, how can I get more women? How can I make more money off of women?
You usually hear of women having to go through 10 to 15 people a night, and this is mainly to make a quota that they're being forced to make.
My initial quota started at $1,000, so $1,000 a day. Once I was able to easily make that, it would go up.
Sometimes if you didn't make your quota for the day, you'll be out all day and all night trying to get it until you did get it. Sometimes there'd be consequences. It was like a constant chase of money. You gotta chase it from place to place.
So what's happening is the cells that are trafficking girls are nationwide. So most of the cells that are trafficking girls effectively have satellites in every major city. So the girls are very easily moved around. Why or how often? It boils down to this. How much money are they making? Is it enough? Could they make more in another city?
It frequently will only be the price of a plane ticket to fly this victim to Las Vegas, New York, Chicago for some major event that draws a lot of men who are away from their families frequently and looking for prostitutes.
You know, from the time that boys grow up as kids, they're almost groomed to do this. They're almost allowed to think that this is natural or a rite of passage, that this is an okay thing to do and that it's harmless. So they convince themselves that it's harmless. They want this, they're promiscuous. They like having a lot of sex in a day. They basically leave reality in order to make themselves feel better about what they're doing.
What we call that is the normalization construct. And when guys subscribe to that belief system, that the women and girls enjoy it, and that it's just totally normal for guys to do it, that belief system is the single strongest predictor of their likelihood of buying sex now and in the future.
It's sometimes referred to as the pretty woman effect. That movie appeared to show that she was a willing participant, that she was happy with her decision. This is not Pretty Woman.
The fantasy that you allowed me to build for you was all bullshit. It didn't count. I didn't even remember your name. I don't remember what you look like.
You play different roles for the buyer to where they think in their head, she likes it, she's getting money for it, I'm gonna give her money for it. We're all satisfied.
I didn't enjoy any of it. I didn't care for any of them. And I was repulsed. I remember the first time throwing up afterwards.
We know then that belief among buyers is mythology. The question, I think, is whether or not they are creating that belief system to justify what they know to be wrong behavior, or whether or not they just tell themselves that over and over and over again as a way to cover up the reality of what they're actually seeing. It's about 5 to 6% of US men who are currently involved in paying for sex. It sounds like a small percentage, but when you really do the math, you realize we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of men who each year whose spending and whose paid sex activity causes the problem of sex trafficking to perpetuate.
Well, when you talk to buyers, they know it's illegal. They know what they're doing might get them in trouble. They haven't really thought beyond that. And when you say, well, have you thought about the kid that you had sex with or the person that you're intimate with, they've given it no more thought than the waiter who brings their food or the valet who parks their car.
So if you're that guy that goes for a consensual commercial sexual act with another woman, and it is, our research is true, then it's like a coin flip. You don't know. You don't know if that person is consensual or not. You're gonna take that risk, exploiting somebody else's daughter, when you, in your fantasy, think it's a consensual act. It's most likely not.
Men that would never dream of driving down a boulevard and stopping their car and trying to cut a deal with a prostitute on the street. Now in the security and the anonymity of their office, maybe, on their computer or on their phone, will make a date. There is no typical John, if you want to call it that.
I call my talks the guy next door, because it was every profession, it was every income level, it was whoever on the way home from work thought, I could go through drive-thru and get a milkshake, or I could stop over on that street and get a blowjob.
Almost every girl that I've represented has told me that they had customers who were law enforcement officials, who were school teachers, who were city officials, judges, attorneys, and even politicians.
Well, they definitely are all walks of life. I mean, I've seen guys that were 18 and brand new to the military, and I've seen guys that are 80 and married for 30 years and successful businessmen.
Married. Most of them married.
You know, I've worked with people who've worked on the streets who say, you know, dads will come and pick them up with the baby strapped in the car seat and expect a sex act. So, you know, we could try and explain that the mom's at home and not as sexually available as before, but it's much deeper than that. Why would you feel like this was an appropriate sort of activity to add to your day? You know, I'm gonna go back to work relaxed and it's all gonna be wonderful, when really after the moment it was stressful, it was nervous, it wasn't good sex, but it's the anticipation and the idea that it's gonna be all about them in that moment.
For many of these guys, they're not having a good experience either, which makes it all the more sad that they're continuing to engage in it because of the harm that it causes others. It becomes easy to see how strip clubs, legal brothels, and how much of the pornography industry fits into that same category of commercial sexual exploitation. What's the same across all of those forms of exploitation is the inherent devaluation of women, and that objectification of women and girls feeds into this idea that somehow they can be treated as a commodity that can be bought and sold, and that therefore a guy who wants to buy sex, it's not a big leap to begin to do that if he's engaged in some of these other activities that are associated with exploitation. The supply is occurring in response to the demand, which means the demand is the problem. It's not underlying the problem, the demand is the problem. Very few of the men who say they've bought sex in their lifetime have only done it once. We find that a quarter of sex buyers fall into that high frequency category where they're buying at least multiple times a month, and in some cases multiple times per week. Now, that's only 1 in 4 sex buyers, which may not sound like much, but when you realize that how many transactions they account for, they actually represent about 75% of all the sex trades transactions. So we strongly recommend that states adopt what we call a graduated penalty structure. If they recidivate, if they offend after they've been arrested once, there needs to be heightened penalties to reflect that. It's completely unacceptable when a community's average fine is $100. The guy spent more than $100 on paid sex. So there's no way that a $100 fine could be the real source of problem for him. That's completely inadequate.
They pay less as a John than I do. I pay $1,000 because I was prostituting, and they pay $182.
The buyers have the least consequences. I've had a buyer get mad and say he want his money back and take my purse, and I call the police, and the police show up and say, well, you got to give him his money back.
As long as there's no enforcement for the buyers, there's no negative consequence, there's no pressure for them to stop it. What we do have is the stigmatization of people who sell sex without that accompanying sort of shaming of people who buy it.
Historically, the response had been to arrest women and girls involved in prostitution because they were the eyesore, because they were the ones that neighbors were complaining about, because they were the ones that were problematic. That, again, it speaks to the stigma involved for women and girls in the trade.
I did go to jail a lot, a whole lot. I have over 100 cases. I am what they consider a career criminal.
So now I'm documented as a prostitute, and so every time they even like run my name, they're automatically looking at this, and it just became easier and easier for them to like have a reason to throw me in jail. There was nobody offering services, nobody asking, are you all right? It was definitely like criminal mentality. But I am thankful that nowadays it's shifted a little bit to like services offered versus just throwing people in jail and not understanding where they're coming from.
San Diego really led in this area of shifting the lens of law enforcement, shifting the lens of community, so that these kids are not viewed as prostitutes. We created protocols where it was a victim-centered approach. Every person encountered in prostitution is first looked at as a potential victim rather than a potential suspect. That mindset changed, and then we changed the laws to match our mindset.
There have been a lot of awareness efforts that are pushing to change the concept of these girls from being criminals to actually being victims. So over the last couple of years, primarily, more than half the states in the country have adopted safe harbor laws, which are these laws that say they're victims, they aren't criminals, you can't charge them with something they were forced to do. But we have a long road ahead of us as far as trickling down to everyone, because the girls on the street are still being treated badly in many areas.
One of the big challenges we have is these women don't see themselves as victims. And it might take 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 times before they finally realize they're the victim of the crime here. And it's almost like you have to deprogram them.
I wasn't chained to a bed, and I wasn't forcibly, like physically forced to stay anywhere. Granted, sometimes I was, but for the most part, my chains were like in my mind. So how do you get out and try to explain that to people? Like, how do I get out and try to explain to people, like, I'm not handcuffed, but my mind is handcuffed? Like, for me, like, that sounds crazy to me when I say it out loud. And so to try to explain that to my family and try to explain that to myself and understand myself got so stressful that I didn't want to deal with it.
He told me, nobody wants you. Nobody cares about you. Nobody loves you. Look what I do for you. I take care of you. I make sure you eat. I check on you. I bail you out of jail. Sometimes, depending on how bad I hurt you, I take you to the doctor when you need to go. I am your everything. And you believe that this person is your everything, and you feel obligated to this person. You feel like you can't leave them. You feel like you can't go nowhere else. There's nowhere else to turn. It's mental handcuffs that this person has on you. Society doesn't care about you. Nobody gives a fuck about you. You're just a whore. That's all you're good for. And your brain thinks that. You think that even if I try to leave, where am I gonna go? What am I gonna do? Who's gonna hire me with a record a mile long? What man is ever gonna wanna be with a woman that's been with a million other men and they could still see the sins that's all over her body? Who is gonna want me in the end? You feel that. You feel like this is the only person that wants you. So it is hard to leave. It is really hard to leave.
It's so easy to use our preconceived notions about what it means to be a person involved in prostitution and to just ignore the problem that way. But when we start to peel past those layers of stigma and recognize those people as people, and then we start to understand what difficulties they're facing, what types of trauma they're experiencing, you start to recognize the person as a person, And you start to understand that it's not something that they jumped into, it's something that is being done to them.
They often say, you know, prostitution is the oldest profession. I don't think it was a profession. I think it's the oldest abuse of individuals. But still, it's been around forever, and we still have not changed our perception of it very much.
These girls are hidden in plain sight, and it seems as if, you know, no one seems to see them. They walk by them, they belittle them, and they've been forgotten by society. To be forgotten and to be not thought about anymore is probably the worst punishment ever. Just to know that, you know, somebody's daughter feels like she can't go home because she's been on the streets and this is what the pimp told her.
There's still girls out there that's roaming around looking for a family, trying to gain acceptance, and this is where they see acceptance. This is where they seek refuge because the rest of society has forgotten about them.
I think what people from the outside look in to see like this black and white issue of, well, you're being treated bad, so you should go. There's a lot more to it. There's financial struggles, there's legal struggles, there's gap in job history, there's lack of education, there's people that have been abused previously, there's people that have kids that are single moms that don't know how to survive without using their body. There's all of these factors that go into this that really impacts somebody trying to exit and move forward.
The truth is that you can tell a girl all day long, you're better than this, you need to get out of the life. But unless you're willing to provide for all the needs that her pimp is providing for her, there's no chance that she can really do it. She needs a place to stay. She needs food. She needs a source of income. She needs mental health. She needs medical care. She needs all these things, and if you're not ready to give it to her and have access to those resources, you can forget the fact that she's gonna go with you.
We have to understand how difficult this change is and that it's not immediate and that they're going to backslide in terms of not being able to comply with all of these straight, normal rules. So we have to have the patience to understand that it takes 6 or 7 times to exit before they've got the strength and the belief that they're worthy.
So you have to keep working with these people because it takes a lot for us to build up trust. So many people we've trusted in have broken it and broken us that we don't know who to trust.
The recidivism rate is so high. The majority of women, they go back 4 to 16 times before making it out, if they make it out.
We see the highest rate of suicide is not our returning military, it's our sex trafficking victims. The highest rate of overdoses from drugs, the most horrific physical abuse and diseases are to our sex trafficking victims. It's estimated that within 7 years, if we can't recover a victim and help her escape, that she's very likely gonna be at the medical examiners.
Sex trafficking is not something that can be solved alone by nonprofits, law enforcement, prosecutors, service providers. We all have to play a role in continuing to highlight this issue, the gaps that still exist, and what we can do to make improvements.
Everybody wants to raise awareness, and we're raising all this awareness, and so now everybody's aware of the problem, but then what? Then we don't have anywhere for anyone to go. Our human trafficking reports are going up, but our shelters aren't going up. Everyone's calling the hotline to say like, hey, that girl I just saw may be trafficked, but then what?
There's no one silver bullet, one simple answer. It's the community coming together with prosecutors, law enforcement, community-based organizations to provide those wraparound services that'll make that victim safe and hopefully get her back to a normal life.
Education is very important and deterrence is important. When we deal with prevention in the schools, it can't be just about girls protecting themselves from harm. It's about boys not being part of that harm and also protecting themselves. So the prevention has to include boys, girls, men, and women.
Where I think the biggest stride and success is going to be is to start bringing people into the round table and sitting down with them. Survivors of exploitation, survivors of the pimp life, people that have pimped and been on that side, people that have been buyers, implementing all the dynamics and coming together and respecting them for more than their labels. And you can create a program and you can create collaborations that actually work.
To the extent that we're unwilling to talk about the issue, we allow it to fester. It's something that people don't want to pretend has affected their families or affects their communities. But until we have those conversations, it's hard to imagine anything getting solved.
There's so much we don't know about sexual behavior in the US because we're not talking about it early enough, and we're not talking about healthy sexuality. So we can't get to the unhealthy or potentially criminal or potentially harmful sexuality if we're not even starting with the basics.
I mean, it's a cliche that prevention is far less expensive on a community than the cure. In this case, it's magnified 1,000 times. I do think there's a lot of momentum, a lot of progress being made. But moving to a fully mature institutional attack on trafficking, we're still a few years out from that.
I believe that as just concerned citizens, that we should take a look at how can we get involved in this fight. If we do not do something today, we're going to see human sex trafficking take our nation by storm more than it already is.
I think people get caught up in this well, trafficking doesn't really impact me specifically, and so it's hard for me to figure out my avenue to get involved. How do I make time to volunteer? You don't have to. Even if all you do in this movement is to stop stigmatizing, that's doing enough.
Instead of driving down the street and saying, oh, that's a dirty prostitute, say to yourself, I wonder what happened to lead her there.
The harm started way before the sex, and we have to recognize that. Shame on all of us, shame on society if we think that we can pin this only around the sex itself.
We have to ask ourselves, knowing that sex trafficking has been around as long as it has, why have we not done anything about it? Why have we allowed it to perpetuate? Why isn't this making everyone crazy that children are being taken from their families and sold on the street as objects for sex? It should drive us crazy.
All the innocence that was taken away from me from the time I was 14, all the way up until I was 30 years old. Just think about those years and what I could have done with those years if one person would have reached out to me and said, you know what, it's okay, you don't have to do this. I'm gonna help you be a kid. It's important to save those girls because they shouldn't have to go through what I went through. Nobody should have to endure that type of lifestyle.
They may not have our last name, but they are definitely from our neighborhoods. And it's up to us because it's our kids. Failure's not an option.
If you care at all about your own kids or your neighbors or your grandkids, you need to be involved because they are the next victims. To not do anything would be devastating. And that would be the worst thing in the world, to basically give up and to believe that we don't have the capacity to change. And we do. We've made great changes. We just have more changes to make.
We will keep fighting this. We will bring every resource we have, and we will keep working to make sure that we recover the victims and we hold the traffickers accountable and that we hold the buyers accountable, because this is what will define us as a civilization. We cannot have this form of slavery continue.